Today I've been asked to speak about on the subject of a theme, God is love. Some people may ask whether this is relevant to Bhagavan's teachings. Is it necessary to consider such a subject in the context of Bhagavan's teachings? Is it necessary even to believe in God? Well, it is not necessary to believe in God, because all we need to do is we need to investigate ourselves and find out what we actually are. But the concept of God is potentially a useful concept, and Bhagavan has often referred to it. And most people who come to the spiritual path come from some sort of a religious background, or have some sort of an idea about God, some sort of belief in God. So that concept of God is used by Bhagavan and in Advaita philosophy more generally as an aid to turn our attention back within. So when we consider this question, God is love, the first thing we have to ask is, what is meant by the term God? Generally, we all have, the idea of God originated from the fact that as finite human beings, we feel relatively powerless. Our power is very limited. We feel there's some greater power that is moving events. And so it is quite natural for people to believe in that higher power, and it's called God. And in different cultures, they have different beliefs about gods. Some cultures have ideas about many gods, but even those cultures that believe in many gods tend to have an idea of some ultimate power beyond all these. That ultimate power is what is called God with a capital G. But people have different ideas. People think of God as an old man with a grey beard up in the clouds, or someone who's far away in heaven, or they give different names, Vishnu, Shiva, Jesus, Buddha, whatever, Allah, whatever. People have so many different ideas about God. First there are many different names that people use to refer to God, and they attach many concepts to those names. But what Advaita teaches us, and what Bhagavan teaches us, is that what God, ultimately what God is our own self. God is, God actually is the one infinite whole. And since nothing can be other than the infinite whole, we must all be that. Some people say, oh, are we part of that? If we are something small, we can be a part. But actually, in our essence, we're not even a part of God. We are God himself. In Upadesha Undiyar, verse 24, I think, Bhagavan says, Irukum ikayal isa jivagal oru porul le ava undipara upadi unavai verundipara. That means in their being nature, God and souls are one substance. Only their upadhi-unuvu means their awareness of adjuncts, or their sense of adjuncts, is different. What that means, what he means by awareness of adjuncts, what we essentially are is awareness. So in our essential awareness, we are no different from God. Our real substance, and the real substance of God, is only awareness. But we are not aware of ourselves only as awareness. We are now aware of ourselves as a person. As a person, we have a body, we have a mind, we were born, and we're going to die, and so many attributes, so many things we attribute to ourselves, because we take ourselves to be this body. So all these things that we attribute to ourselves, they're upadhis, they're adjuncts, things that we've added to ourselves and we take to be ourselves. So what divides us from God is these adjuncts. And just like because we've limited ourselves with this set of adjuncts, we say God is infinite, but we can't actually form a mental concept of the infinite. Even the term infinite is a negative term. It means it's not finite, it's not limited. Except in negative terms, we can't actually conceive what that is, because the finite can only know what is finite, and only the infinite can know what is infinite. So we cannot adequately conceive what that infinite whole is. So we form a certain concept about God. All the ideas we have about God, that is his adjuncts. But our adjuncts and the adjuncts that we attribute to God all exist only in our view, not in the view of God, because God is just that pure awareness. What is aware of anything other than itself is not pure awareness, but only this mixed awareness, I am this body, the ego. When we exist as pure awareness, we cannot know anything other than pure awareness. Because as Bhagavan says in verse 4 of Ulladu, if oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. If one is not a form, who can see their forms and how? And then in the next sentence he says, Kanalal Kakshiondo. That means, can what is seen be other than the eye? So if the awareness is aware of itself as a form, it will see forms. If the awareness is aware of itself as finite, it will see what is finite. If the awareness is aware of itself not as a form or not as finite, it will only see what is infinite. In other words, it will see only itself. So all these adjuncts that we are aware of, both our own adjuncts and the adjuncts that we attribute to God, all exist in our view. So we have a limited view of God. Because we've limited ourselves, we cannot but have a limited view of God. And because our view of God is limited, God seems to be something other than ourselves, and we seem to be something other. Only when we know what we ourselves actually are, will we be able to experience God as ourselves. Now we have an idea, we learn from Upanishads, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Brahman is a term that means God in the most abstract or metaphysical sense. In other words, the infinite whole. I am Brahman. You are that. You yourself are Brahman or God. This self is Brahman. And prajnanam Brahman. Pure awareness is Brahman. So from all these we understand what we really are is Brahman. But though we had this idea now, because we read about this in books, we still experience ourselves as this body. We still experience ourselves as a person. So we're not now experiencing ourselves as Brahman. Until we experience what we really are, which is Brahman, that separation between ourselves and God will seem to be there. And so, because we conceive of God as something infinitely greater than us, but still something other than ourselves, that's how the path of bhakti comes into being. We want to return to God. We want to merge back into God. And so we pray to God, we worship God, the whole path of bhakti comes. That is useful so long as our mind is turned outwards. And let's face it, even after reading Bhagavan's teachings, even after learning, but what we should be doing is turning back within, turning to face ourselves. Most of the time our attention is turned outwards. Most of the time we're aware of things other than ourselves. Because this is the very nature of the ego. As Bhagavan says in verse 25 of Ulladu, rises by grasping form, stands by grasping form. Grasping and feeding on form, it flourishes. Leaving one form, it grasps another form. What he means by form is any phenomena. And the first phenomena we're aware of, the first phenomena we grasp, is the body that we now take to be ourself. So the very nature of ego rises by facing outwards, facing away from itself. That's why he says in the same verse, Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. That's if the ego, whose nature is to be aware of things other than itself, to rise and grasp in its awareness other things, if it tries to turn back towards itself to see what it itself is, it will disappear. The ego seems to exist only so long as we're looking away from ourselves. The ego is born of attachment. It's born by grasping form. So generally the ego has very strong desires and attachments. it's constantly trying to face outwards for its own survival. Because most of the time our attention is turned outwards, the concept of God can be a useful concept. When we are trying to turn within and trying and finding we're constantly failing, sometimes we become dispirited. The concept of God can then help us. We can turn to God in prayer, as Bhagavan has taught us the path of prayer in how we should pray. We shouldn't be praying for anything external, anything outside ourselves, because what is we are to experience in our outward life, what is to happen, will happen, whatever effort we make to prevent it, and what is not to happen will not happen, how much effort we make to achieve it. So we cannot change anything outwardly. So praying for outward things is, I wouldn't say useless, but it's not going to change things if we pray for outward things. If we pray, if a dear friend or relative is sick, we may pray for their recovery or something. That's not going to actually change anything. But it makes us feel better sometimes when we pray. Because we do, even atheists in effect pray, because we all wish for something. And and that's what prayer is about. We're wishing for something. I mean, if we're praying for wealth and other things, that's not going to purify our mind. Because then God is just a means to our end. We're not really in love with God. We're in love with what we can get from God. But if we are praying selflessly, to the extent that our prayer or our worship of God is selfless, to that extent it will purify our mind. And a purified mind is necessary to turn within. So we can't say prayer is useless, because it can potentially purify the mind. But what is the useful thing to pray about is to pray for the annihilation of our own ego. Why is that prayer useful? Because in order for the ego to be annihilated, it must be willing to sacrifice itself. It must be willing to surrender to God. It must be willing to surrender to Bhagavan. Bhagavan is never going to come and kill our ego until we are ready to offer it to him. He will never force the annihilation of the ego on us. Only when we are ready, when we have love to merge back in, complete, absolute, all-consuming love to merge back in him, will our ego be annihilated. So praying for the annihilation of the ego is basically channeling our love towards that. So what God essentially is our own self. But what he seems to be is something other than ourselves, because he is infinite, we are finite. There seems to be a separation. But actually, nothing can be other than the infinite, so we cannot actually be other than God. So in the path of devotion always starts with the concept of God as another. So we worship God either by physically, by body, by doing puja, outward worship, or we do inward prayers or japa or singing stotras or something. We do that by speech. And by mind we do meditation. But even when meditating, we're still meditating on God as something other than ourselves initially.